Japanese Self-Defense Force. In the turbulent years after the Second World War, the Self-Defense Force was established as part of a protracted campaign to forge a new Japanese post-war identity that championed peace. As a result, this unique military organization adopted a purely defensive stance, in the belief that it could curb the rampant militarism that had plunged the island nation into tragedy. However, as the international situation fundamentally changed, and Japan became a respected and economically robust world power, the wisdom of such a pacifist posture and the over-reliance on the US for protection began to be seriously questioned. Formation. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese Empire formally surrendered to the Allies. The agreement not only marked the end of the Pacific War, but the destruction of Japan's core identity, for the man responsible for the calamity, Emperor Hirohito, also renounced his divinity. With Japan no longer a sacred land ruled by a benevolent divine emperor, the search for an alternative national character commenced, as an Allied force headed by the American general Douglas MacArthur occupied the country and disbanded the Japanese military, removed its wartime leaders, and broke up the industrial conglomerates known as the Zaibatsu that had fueled the wartime push. This culminated in the signing of the Japanese Constitution in 1947, and Article 9, which forbade Japan from ever waging war again, and barred them from building up their own military forces. On the other hand, with the ink barely dry on the paper, Article 9 was soon being reconsidered, as the Cold War intensified following the Russian occupation of Eastern Europe and the victory of the Chinese Communists in the Chinese Civil War in 1949. As a result, US policymakers, terrified of the growing communist threat, backtracked and began rearming Japan for its own Cold War objectives in what is now known as the reverse course. Among the most significant measures was the formation of the National Police Reserve Force in 1950, composed of 75,000 men. When the Americans withdrew from Japan in 1952, the conservative government, encouraged by the US and fired by a desire to protect themselves from China and Russia, continued to militarize. Consequently, in 1954, the National Police Reserve was transformed into the Japanese Self-Defense Force, an organization that was technically deemed a police force to avoid conflict with Article 9, and whose purpose was solely to prevent direct or indirect aggression. The Self-Defense Force was made up of three branches: the Ground Self-Defense Force, the Maritime Self-Defense Force, and the Air Self-Defense Force. The Self-Defense Force, however, was still very much limited in its power by the Americans. In May 1957, the Japanese government released a statement outlining their basic national defense policy that asserted that Japan could only defend itself from external aggression in cooperation with the Americans. Thus, to protect their motherland, Japan now had to rely on thousands of US soldiers stationed in various bases across the country, a fact that would sit uneasily with many Japanese over the next few decades, as the international political situation radically changed. The slippery slope back to militarization. After over 20 years of adherence, the Japanese and US governments showed signs they were reconsidering their original defense treaty for purely practical reasons. In 1981, with the Second World War a distant memory, President Ronald Reagan and Japanese Premier Genko Suzuki announced that the Japanese were now allowed to defend their territory up to a distance of 1,000 nautical miles. For many years after no further expansion took place, the Japanese Self-Defense Force would remain purely defensive, owing to a domestic political climate that had maintained a distaste for war. However, in an indication that Japan was eager to have a peacekeeping role, the Japanese government contributed $13 billion and 6 minesweepers to US forces participating in the 1990 to 1991 Gulf War. Although not militarily involved, it would certainly be a harbinger of things to come as the Japanese, now a respected global power, pushed for greater responsibility on the international stage. Discussions came to a head in 1992, when Japan passed a new law allowing the Self-Defense Force to assist in UN peacekeeping operations, with the first SDF unit sent to Cambodia the next year. This was followed up by a greater expansion of Japanese defensive responsibilities in 1997, in reaction to the fall of the Soviet Union, which permitted the JSDF to operate separate from its home islands and surrounding areas. In 2001, motivated by a desire to wage a proactive campaign against international terrorism, Premier Junichiro Koizumi sent the Maritime Self-Defense Force to the Indian Ocean to provide logistical support to the U.S. military in their Afghanistan campaign. In the first overseas action and the most radical reinterpretation of the Japanese military since the end of the Second World War, the JSDF would also help the Iraqis rebuild their nation in 2003, in a series of events that demonstrated just how far the Self-Defense Force had strayed from its original objectives. In 2005, this was formally recognized with the revision of the U.S.-Japanese alliance, which stipulated that one of the JSDF's new goals was to improve the international security environment, a phrase that strongly hinted that Japan was now willing to intervene in foreign countries in partnership with the USA for the sake of global security. This was confirmed in 2007 with the revision of the Self-Defense Forces Act and the redefinition of JSDF activities abroad from miscellaneous regulations to basic duties. The reframing of its key goals meant the Japanese Self-Defense Force was no longer a solely defensive entity. Accordingly, in 2006, the Japanese parliament approved an act to upgrade its defense agency into a full ministry with a greater degree of autonomy. With Japan now allowed to respond to situations that they perceived to threaten their internal security, in March 2009, 2 units from the Maritime Self-Defense Force were dispatched off the coast of Somalia to deal with pirates, while in 2010, Japan established its first overseas military base in Djibouti. China, Russia, and the Japanese collective defense. Going into the 2012 general election, Article 9 continued to be a hot-button issue as the North Korean nuclear program and territorial disputes with China caused many Japanese to question the wisdom of their pacifist stance. This was reflected in the landslide victory of Liberal Democrat Party candidate Shinzo Abe, one of the most vocal advocates for remilitarization, who upon being installed in office immediately set up an advisory group to investigate if a revised version of Article 9 was in Japan's best interest. On July 1st, 2014, it was announced that Article 9 and the very nature of the Japanese Self-Defense Force had been altered to allow it to intervene in foreign countries if the stability and security of Japan was threatened, reasoning that such measures were necessary if Japan were to be a responsible global power. Shinzo's historic decision was met with great pushback from Japanese citizens, with one man even self-immolating at Shinjuku Station in protest. Nevertheless, the amendment was promulgated in 2016, ushering in a rush of unprecedented Japanese military activity. In 2018, to counteract the perceived threat of China, Japan's first Marine unit was activated. While that same year, the Self-Defense Force conducted joint exercises on Japanese soil with British soldiers for the first time, in response to renewed tensions with North Korea. The next year, Japan sent its first peacekeeping mission without the UN to the Sinai Peninsula to monitor a ceasefire between Israel and Egypt. And in 2020, at the same time it was developing long-range missiles to counter Chinese expansion in the East China Sea, an agreement was also brokered with India to enable both nations to exchange supplies and logistical support. Most recently, the circumnavigations of Japan by Chinese and Russian vessels in 2022 and other factors has prompted Japan to significantly increase its defense budget. In November 2022, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida Fumio announced that Japan would now dedicate 2% of its GDP to defense spending by 2027, which will make the island nation the third largest military spender after China and the USA, a policy that was absolutely unthinkable only 70 years previously. It illustrates that even the most peace-loving of nations, such as Japan, cannot ignore the international situation, and that the original Japanese Self-Defense Force formed after World War II was perhaps a little too idealistic to work in reality.